Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Ryan Grauer. I'm an associate professor of international affairs in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to the first of our series of talks on nuclear weapons in the modern era. This is a series of talks presented by the Ridgway Center and supported in part by the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and the University Center for International Studies here at the University of Pittsburgh. The topic of nuclear weapons and their potential use in the international system is a disconcertingly real proposition today. As we observe the events going on in Ukraine in particular, and we see President Vladimir Putin's wanton cruelty towards civilians and his explicit rattling of the nuclear saber, we have many security analysts, policymakers, and average citizens thinking about nuclear weapons in a way that most of them haven't for about 30 years since the end of the Cold War. The purpose of this series is to bring together a group of scholars who didn't stop thinking about nuclear weapons and their role in the international system 30 years ago. And today's talk, which is co-sponsored by the Women in International Security chapter here at the University of Pittsburgh, is going to be presented by Dr. Rupal Mehta. She's from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and she's both a faculty fellow with the Nebraska Strategic Research Institute and a research collaborator at the Center for Peace and Security Studies at the University of California, San Diego. She's a consultant for the Director's Strategic Resilience Initiative in the National Security and International Studies Office at Los Alamos National Laboratory, and she consults with the Office of the Cooperative Threat Reduction in the United States State Department. She was previously a Stanton Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard University, and she's widely published on nuclear matters. Her first book was published with Oxford University Press and was titled Delaying Doomsday, The Politics of Nuclear Reversal. And her second book is under review, and it focuses on atomic uncertainty, information problems in nuclear negotiations. She's published in a wide range of scholarly outlets, including the Journal of Conflict Resolution, International Studies Quarterly, and the Journal of Strategic Studies. And her commentary has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, War on the Rocks, and other outlets. Today, she's going to talk about some of her work on extended nuclear deterrence, and specifically what she calls the Patron's Dilemma. She's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Please submit any questions that you have through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll moderate the questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. As you undoubtedly noticed when you entered the room, today's session is being recorded, and we will make the video available to you all once it is done. So, Dr. Mehta, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and to the organizers for having me out here today. This has been a very odd few weeks for most of us, especially since we've all been distracted by the news in Ukraine and in Europe. So I really appreciate you all being here with me today. I'm going to try to speak for about 45 minutes, and there's going to be conversations that I hope are relevant, especially to a lot of the events that we're seeing in Europe at this moment. And then I'm very much looking forward to questions at the end about both my talk and about other current events that might be of interest. So this presentation and this research project actually began as a couple of papers with my co-author Neil Narang, who's a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And we started by questioning some of the sort of policies, some of the news that were coming out, especially during the Trump administration, about the US's positions on alliances, what their interest was in engaging with NATO and with European allies. And I think this photo sort of sums up some of the quizzical announcements and declarations that came out during the Trump administration about the value that the United States held for multilateral and bilateral alliances. This photo is especially stark because two of these three leaders are no longer in positions of power. President Macron is still playing a significant role, not just in NATO and the EU, but also in global affairs. But what the motivation for our research and for this book was sort of examining the evolving role of multilateral alliances like NATO, like the bilateral alliances, like the United States' alliances with Taiwan and South Korea and others, and trying to really pinpoint some of the mixed results, some of the mixed implications that we had been seeing in the literature, but also in policy. As we started to see both policymakers, on the one hand, extol the value of alliances, and on the other hand, question some of the limitations of alliances, whether or not it was important for the US to maintain its support of multilateral institutions like NATO. We wanted to get a sense of what actually was going on the ground, behind the scenes. So this was in part one of the pieces of our motivation. The other one stemmed from sort of less, maybe alliances that were less on the forefront. So institutions that were playing a key role in global affairs, but maybe weren't getting as much attention as NATO or as the US's alliance with South Korea, especially in light of provocations from North Korea. And here there's a photo of some of the islands that are in dispute between Japan and Taiwan as part of a much more complicated story and situation where the United States has both alliances with Japan and Taiwan and is trying to navigate how to manage those bilateral alliances and relations, given that they're in dispute with each other over a series of islands, like many other disputes in South Asia and the East Asian Sea. So this was in part, I think our interest in this was driven by a couple of different things. First, we were sort of keeping an eye on the evolving US preference for alliances, in part during the Trump administration, but also just over time. And then second, sort of observing how there can be concerns over some of our allies engaging in behavior that could lead to less than ideal outcomes. So we wanted to get a sense of what was actually going on. And that was part of why we started writing these papers and then ultimately shifting to our interest in writing a book. This also came at the same time when we were seeing some pretty key policy analysts and policymakers start to really question the utility and value of alliances, even those that were calling on the United States to publicly limit their commitments to extended nuclear deterrence in the event that they could embolden US allies. Or other analysts, including policymakers, that were saying that our deepening commitment could encourage these states to press their claims with more confidence and potentially lead to a crisis escalation with adversaries, including nuclear armed adversaries. And lastly, academic scholars, like those that were suggesting that these security guarantees could actually encourage or facilitate reckless behavior or reckless driving. So we're seeing this sort of a menu of different options here. We see alliances that are seemingly very important, like NATO, and a lot of policymakers encouraging for the deepening of those alliances. And at the same time, we're observing analysts, policymakers, and other scholars suggesting that we should not be pressing forward, that there might be some need to press the brakes on these alliances because they could be encouraging reckless behavior or emboldenment. So we started to think through this puzzle and assess where the different perspectives were coming from. And so, of course, we went back to much of the existing literature on this by looking at both scholars that had studied conventional military alliances and those that had started their exploration into extended nuclear deterrent agreements. And I'm going to, in just a moment, I'm going to get to some of those definitions so that we're all on the same page about what I mean by them. But there had really been, despite these concerns, especially from policymakers and from other analysts, there had actually been some pretty weak evidence that alliances could lead to this concern of emboldenment or entrapment and moral hazard, and thus increase the likelihood of war. So on the one hand, we have scholars like Michael Beckley in 2015 that actually argued, like much of the other literature in the past, that conventional military alliances create restraint. There's not that much evidence of entanglement. And the only way you could really build a case for entanglement is if you commit some serious methodological errors in your analysis. And some of that was backed up by other scholars like Matthew Furman and Todd Sexter, whose research on nuclear umbrellas similarly revealed that there may not be a systematic pattern of evidence that clients or allies of nuclear powers are actually becoming emboldened. In fact, their research suggested that nuclear defense pacts seem to have a constraining or restraining effect on the behavior of allies in a way that shouldn't make us wholly concerned about that. And the logic that they laid out in this book was that, or in this paper, was that clients are nervous about risking the support of their patrons or damaging the trust and relationship that they have with their nuclear armed patrons. They're worried about losing security guarantees, and that's actually what does this restraint. It actually is what convinces them to not become emboldened and to stay within sort of the lines and the scope of the alliance agreement. So we have this sort of this dilemma, this puzzle between what policymakers are observing, even what we're seeing in terms of current events, and yet we have this literature that suggests that we should not be worried about it. So our motivation came from sort of laying out these two positions and trying to figure out where the evidence actually lies. So just to give you a quick sense of some of the concepts here and what I'm thinking about or what Neil and I are talking about when we're thinking about nuclear umbrellas or about extended nuclear deterrent, they're a type of alliance commitment, and we use a lot of these terms interchangeably: nuclear security assurance, nuclear defensive pact, or a commitment to extended nuclear deterrence. And they all sort of talk about the same thing, which is an alliance commitment that has a nuclear weapons component, whereby the patron, usually the United States in our analyses, but can extend to other countries as well, ensures the security of its ally, including the use of nuclear weapons if necessary. And a lot of these debates about the value of alliances, especially from some of those policy analysts and policymakers, in contrast to some of our academic scholars, are all sort of assessing the value of these alliances in the shadow of nuclear weapons, right? What's underlying much of the debate and the dilemma about this is coming from the fact that it is not just a conventional world anymore. At the tip of the spear is always this concern of nuclear weapons. And I think we're seeing that play out in Ukraine very clearly, especially when we have President Putin on one hand saying he is interested in putting his nuclear forces on alert, and that any move by NATO or by the West that would threaten the existence or the existential security of Russia could be responded to with the use of nuclear weapons, right? All of this is happening in the shadow of nuclear weapons. And what we're really interested in ascertaining is whether or not this logic of moral hazard or emboldenment by our allies is actually so pervasive that it might be something that is negative about alliances, right? There's all these benefits of alliances, both conventional and nuclear. I'll get to that in just a moment, but there is this logic, this concern that might be underlying this, especially in the context of nuclear umbrellas, that we want to focus on, and at least to get a sense and a handle on. Okay, so the primary research questions that we ask in our book that I'm going to talk about today is, has the US's, the American nuclear umbrella, actually encouraged allies or clients to press their claims when they otherwise would not have? Have they become more emboldened to seek specific benefits when in a counterfactual world they would otherwise not have done that? And then second, and more broadly, do these commitments to extended deterrence create this type of moral hazard? So clients are becoming more emboldened to become revisionary, to try to change the status quo in their behavior, because in the back of their heads, they're anticipating that their nuclear patron will intervene on their behalf and help them with their claims. So these are some of the core research questions that we ask in the book and try to sort of answer in a variety of different methodological ways. But just to give you a sense of what our argument is and where we're going with our logic, we argue that the same mechanisms that actually make extended deterrent agreements work, that facilitate the creation and enforcement of these agreements, can also increase the risks of this emboldenment and moral hazard. And empirically, what we find is that the link between nuclear umbrellas and moral hazard is real, but it's going to be reflected not in war, but in some of the outcomes short of war. So diplomatic wrangling or other bargaining outcomes that don't actually lead to full-scale violence. So if that is true and our argument is supported by our evidence, then how do we sort of navigate this? How do we move forward? So the second half of our research and the second half of our book looks at trying to manage these concerns of moral hazard. Patrons can design alliance commitments to help limit obligations, induce restraint, while still trying to be assuring to those allies that might be worried about the strength of the US's commitment. But paradoxically, and this is where I think the real sort of the core contribution of our research comes from, is that mitigating this risk, mitigating the risk of moral hazard, requires that the patron induce some uncertainty as to the extent of its commitment that can both limit the amount of assurance that an ally gets, but also can help make sure that that deterrence works. And that's, to some degree, the sort of patron's dilemma that we're observing here, that these agreements require some degree of uncertainty to restrain allies and make these deterrent agreements work. But in doing so, they actually are uncertain, and they're creating some degree of ambiguity for both allies and patrons. And that's the dilemma that we think is quite important, and we're trying to examine both theoretically and empirically. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what the project looks like, I'm only going to be talking about the first half of this project today, but we explore two different aspects of this dilemma, or the sort of Janus-faced nature of alliances. We first explore recklessness by looking at the benefits and burdens of nuclear umbrellas, some of the unintended or unforeseen consequences of these extended deterrent agreements, especially when it comes to the potential for moral hazard and emboldenment. And we explored this both quantitatively using a large N study of alliances over time. And we also explore this qualitatively from some evidence from the US-Taiwan Mutual Defense Treaty. I'm not going to get into the specific case of US-Taiwan today, but I'm happy to chat a little bit about where some of our evidence is leading us in that case. And then the second half of the book that I'm not going to address today sort of explores the flip side of this coin, which is if we do have this recklessness, and we do want to help restrain or create ways to provide constraints for our allies, how can we do that? How can we redesign some of these agreements? How can we redesign some of these treaties to help us limit the potential emboldenment or moral hazard of our client states? And that we use evidence from the historical record as well, and include a significant case study of the US commitment to Nato, which has become all the more important in the past month. And then we conclude with some implications for grand strategy moving forward. Our research really begins, though, by looking at some of the canonical literature on alliances. And there's really been sort of two camps in this debate. The first that is sort of extolling the benefits of alliances in that they help aggregate capabilities. Individual states don't need to pursue specific military capabilities if they can be augmented by combining the bargaining power of allied states into one big alliance. And what that also suggests is that if there is any need for, if there is any sort of foreign aggressor or any sort of dispute, there are going to be bigger deterrence benefits that result from these alliances. On the flip side, though, another set of literature has suggested that there are some pretty significant concerns that might arise from these type of alliances. States that are protected might become emboldened or intransigent when it comes to negotiations with their adversaries. And some of the conventional or canonical wisdom is that alliance commitments can actually embolden those partners in a way that can entrap their patron into a conflict that they don't want to be a part of. This was definitely some of the concerns that the United States had in the first and second Taiwan Straits crisis, where some of the behavior of Taiwan was suggesting that they were hoping or planning on entrapping the United States into fighting against mainland China in a way that would have been absolutely devastating, especially since it would have been, especially after the second Taiwan Straits crisis, between two nuclear armed powers. So there is this concern, despite the potential benefits of an alliance in terms of its ability to aggregate or augment military capabilities through combined bargaining power, that you can see moral hazard, the concerns of entrapment, and ultimately an escalation in the risk of conflict. And from there, we actually have the first sort of conventional hypothesis, meaning not conventional weapons, but sort of the canonical hypothesis that comes from this literature, which is that client states or allies that are protected through these institutions are more likely to initiate and potentially escalate an ongoing militarized dispute. This is definitely one of the core hypotheses that has emerged from this prior literature. We wanted to explore it as a first test of whether or not this was something that was going on empirically, given the wide range of theoretical literature that we had observed. And then see whether or not there were some conditions or some nuances on the margins that might explain some of the mixed results and mixed findings we had seen in other forms of research. Our theory builds on this, though, and takes a slightly different approach to this, which is that, yes, it is the case that nuclear weapons can help aggregate capabilities and enhance a state's capabilities, especially for the ally, where maybe they don't have access to advanced conventional capabilities or other emerging technologies. And so the fact that they have a nuclear armed patron on their side really can influence and shift the balance of power in their favor. But the bargaining theory suggests that even then, even in these scenarios, adversaries or targets of this alliance would act rationally and try to offer concessions to avoid costly fighting. And I'm happy to get into why there's been some new and interesting conversations recently about the limits of rationality and whether or not there are actually limits to whether leaders are behaving rationally in interstate relations, especially with what we've seen in the past couple of weeks. But this is the theory that has been laid out, right? Bargaining theory suggests that we should basically be doing everything we can to avoid costly fighting. So what happens is the nuclear umbrellas can impact the distribution of influence, especially diplomatic influence in favor of client states, especially because targets, seeing that they now have a nuclear armed patron, are going to try to do whatever they can to avoid a potential crisis. What this also should do is impact the distribution of stakes so that targets here are offering concessions as much as they can to de-escalate crises and to avoid either an escalation in militarized dispute or initiation, depending on where we are in a conflict. So just to give you a quick graphical sense of what our theory is saying, we have at first maybe a bargaining interaction between state A and state B where there is no nuclear armed patron. And then when you involve now a country in an alliance where all of a sudden you have a new actor that might have nuclear weapons, this can actually shift the bargaining range. And what this does is it might make state A, which is the ally, more emboldened to challenge state B because they have in their corner a nuclear weapons state that is shifting the balance of power and is shifting the different potential outcomes between the three actors. And what this does is it shifts the bargaining range, but also creates the potential for moral hazard. Our theory, though, is that we're not going to see an increase in conflict because there still is the option to resolve the dispute, but we're actually going to see moral hazard and the outcomes of moral hazard manifest in diplomatic influence, negotiated settlements, and other bargaining outcomes short of war. Because even despite the fact that an ally now has a nuclear patron, the adversary is going to do whatever it can to avoid escalation to costly conflict. So from here, we have two sort of basic core hypotheses that we've derived. The first is that allies that are protected in this form of institution by a nuclear weapons state are more likely to receive diplomatic missions from other countries and receive higher level diplomatic missions from other states. So we're starting to see an expansion of the influence of diplomacy as measured by diplomatic missions. And the second is that client states that are protected in an alliance by a nuclear weapons patron are more likely to receive, I'm sorry, there's a typo here, more likely to receive concessions and other forms of negotiated settlements by the target, by the adversary. Okay, so how do we test all of this? We do a couple of different things, as I mentioned at the outset. First is we engage in a large and statistical analysis of nuclear umbrellas from 1950 to 2000. And here we focus on a directed dyad unit of analysis to help us differentiate between the behavior of initiators and targets, really to help sort of iron out and explore this logic of moral hazard. So just to give a quick description of the independent variable, this comes from the ATOP data set. If there is a defensive commitment by a nuclear weapons state in that particular dyad, it gets coded dichotomously. There have been 340 active alliances throughout this period, 150 of which were defensive pacts, and about 67 of these include a nuclear weapon state. So it's not a huge number, but it's pretty substantial. So what this comes to is about 13.5% of potential challengers are actually protected by an extended nuclear agreement with a nuclear weapon state. Our dependent variables explore a few different parts, a few different variables from sort of outcomes of interest. So the first is looking at the initiation of a militarized interstate dispute. Second is looking at an escalation of a militarized interstate dispute. And then to test our second and third hypotheses, we look at whether or not the challenger here, the ally, is receiving diplomatic recognition from its adversary and the level of that diplomatic mission. And then third, and finally, we explore whether or not there is an attempt to resolve an issue or a conflict, and whether or not that attempt is peaceful and which side receives the concession. Just to give a quick sense of what this variable looks like, in part because I think it's not been as studied in the international relations literature as some of the other variables, such as militarized interstate disputes, we did want to observe whether or not it was the case that there was substantial variation or any variation in diplomatic recognition. And aside from what we see in television programs where all of a sudden you see consular or embassies close or mission officers being sent back to their home countries, we wanted to actually see whether or not empirically we could observe this from the data. And what we actually see is there is a fair bit of variation. We see that there's variation in whether or not there is a representative, if a representative is removed, if there is a minister or an envoy there, and whether or not there's even an embassy or a high commissioner. So there is pretty important and systematic variation in this variable that gives us some confidence that this is one of the ways in which we're seeing the effect of moral hazard and emboldenment play out in diplomatic outcomes. So then to give us a quick sense of some of our results from the quantitative part of this project, we first wanted to test that conventional or canonical hypothesis that suggested that states that are protected by alliances are more likely to both initiate and escalate militarized interstate disputes with their opponents or their adversaries. And what we actually find is that there's not a great deal of support of that for many different types of these conflicts. Many of these conflicts don't actually cross the threshold of significance. So what we are seeing is that nuclear umbrellas might make allies more likely to initiate one-sided uses of force, but maybe not more likely to initiate two-sided uses of force that is reciprocal or war on a large scale. So there are some effects that are being observed, but it's usually one-sided. So what happens then? If it is the case that an ally is emboldened to initiate a one-sided use of force, what then happens in terms of the adversary or opponent's behavior? So that was where we started to test a little bit of the hypotheses we have about these bargaining outcomes short of conflict. And here what we test is the effect of nuclear umbrellas on diplomatic recognition. And what we see is these pretty strong positive results. There is a positive and statistically significant likelihood that the nuclear umbrella that is being provided to a client state increases the likelihood that they'll receive any diplomatic recognition and even the level of diplomatic recognition. So that's pretty good support for hypothesis 2. Now, when it comes to one of our core hypotheses and dependent variables, what we wanted to observe here is whether or not a nuclear umbrella increases the likelihood of a peaceful settlement attempt by a target or by the adversary. And it does show here that when challenger states are covered under a nuclear umbrella, there is not a strong likelihood that there's going to be a peaceful settlement attempt. This is pretty concerning. What this suggests is that there's more going on here under the scene and behind the scenes that is really important to our understanding. There might be other disaggregated variables. There might be other things that we need to be looking at here, because it's not clear that the nuclear umbrellas is doing the effect that it needs to be doing. Maybe it's the case that a challenger is not convinced by the security commitment and thus is not willing to offer concessions. But regardless, it is important for us to be sort of digging into this finding to see what's really going on. And lastly, what you look here is the impact of a nuclear umbrella on the likelihood that a target state or a challenger state will renounce the issue under dispute. And here we're seeing that there's a possibility of that. There is this way in which a concession could be made from the target. It is just barely significant. Okay. So now with that, we have some pretty interesting findings that reveal that there is some degree of concern in terms of issuing one-sided uses of force by allies, that there may not be the strong concessionary bent that we observe or we imagine when we think about adversaries. So how do we sort of make sense of all of this? And what are some of the limitations or opportunities that we might have to further investigate some of these claims? So first, I think it's really important to note here that we are seeing some pretty important and very clear impacts of nuclear weapons compared to just conventional alliances. So when we do take a stand to sort of separate out those two things, there is work being done by the nuclear weapon. I think that's especially made clear when we look into some of these cases, especially US-Taiwan, US-NATO. There is the potential for confounds that are really important here, including the Cold War. It very much could be the case that the Cold War is playing this really critical role that is not being covered in our statistical analysis, but we need to unpack further in some of our qualitative analyses. Lastly, next, there could be the concern of endogeneity, whereby there could already be prior diplomatic standing, especially for countries that already are part of a nuclear umbrella. They might be seen as already more powerful and more important. So we have a sort of baseline of diplomatic standing that we need to sort of think about. Next, we need to consider in our research whether or not the patron is already starting to moderate some of their client demands through bilateral conversations or through other forms of diplomatic wrangling that might prevent a client from going and seeking out super aggressive demands against their adversary in a way that is sort of shrinking a lot of the extreme options that we might observe. Next, we need to think about instances in which a client and target could be covered by the same nuclear umbrella. That brings us back to the example of the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, where both Japan and Taiwan are actually both allies of the United States. What happens then if we have some disputes or conflict between two allies where they both have protection from the same extended deterrent? And then lastly, while this research is robust to other forms of data, including the international crisis behavior data, part of our goal moving forward is to really ensure that the effects that we're seeing, both quantitatively and qualitatively, can be explored in a broader range, not just in terms of time, but in terms of other forms of conflict that are really, or other forms of crises that are really critical to our understanding. So as I was drafting this talk and thinking about our research and what it might say about the current context in Ukraine and what some of the implications can be, especially for our NATO chapter in part 2, the United States is part of this pretty significant multilateral alliance that includes 30 member states, but does not include Ukraine, which is an important part to the conversations we're hearing today. There is, of course, now particular interest and concern that some members of NATO, like Poland or other Baltic states, might be potential targets of Russian aggression. That's in part why they have been asking for an increase in both military hardware, but also in terms of physical tripwires like troops. There has been a little bit of confusion. I think even as we're talking now, President Biden is trying to navigate some of the recent confusion about sending fighter jets to Poland that would then be transported to Germany, that would then be handed over to the Ukrainian military. There's been a lot of confusion and concern that those actions, especially handing over this degree of military assistance to NATO member states, then on to another partner of NATO, which is Ukraine, could create this potential for moral hazard. I think we saw that pretty well when Poland sort of unilaterally announced that they would be sending these MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine, and it had not been discussed with the United States or the rest of NATO. And it does suggest that this moral hazard concern, especially when you have very fearful NATO member states like Poland and the former Baltic states that are worried about the Russian threat, might start to engage in behavior that is emboldened and potentially entrapping the United States. And here's where the US must really carefully balance some of those issues with assuring allies that the US and the remainder of NATO will be there in the event of aggression upon their borders without risking concerns of escalation or without damaging the deterrent that has been set up between the United States and Russia. This is a really complicated situation that we're seeing all these different manifestations of in all sorts of policy conversations, whether it's about the transference of fighter jets or other forms of military assistance, the creation of a no-fly zone, which would by necessity require NATO or US jets to shoot down Russian jets. There's all sorts of things that are coming up, especially with regard to the robustness of alliances. But here, I think it is this patron's dilemma. It is this nature of balancing the assurance of the institution without risking the potential for escalation, especially with an adversary that has shown no real concerns about escalation to and including the use of nuclear weapons. So with that, I'll end here. And I'm very much looking forward to our conversation about not just the theory and the empirics here, but also about some of the applications and some of the issues that we're observing with the current conflict in Ukraine. I guess one thing I should mention just as we're wrapping up is that it is not the case that this is some unknown or ambiguous concern. The risk of moral hazard is quite clear. We're seeing it today. And while it is the case that client states are not emboldened to initiate one-sided crises, they are emboldened to initiate one-sided crises, they're not going to escalate to war. And that is part of how we can design institutions to be assured of that. And lastly, given that our findings suggest that client states are actually more likely to be recipients of diplomatic influence and concessions, how can we establish and design institutions to assure that that's the outcomes that we're observing rather than the escalation to full-scale violence? So with that, I thank you in advance and I look forward to our conversation.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Rupal. That was a really interesting talk, and it raised a lot of questions for me, and I'm sure questions for members of our audience as well. So for those of you in the audience, if you have questions for Dr. Mehta, please put them in the Q&A, and I will moderate them. But while you are composing your thoughts, the question, I have several questions that came to mind, but perhaps the first one I would pose to you is the finding that you all have that recipients of this nuclear umbrella protection are more likely to initiate one-sided violence. The extender of the umbrella has to be aware and think about these things. And maybe could you talk a little bit about the research that you and Neil have done? To what extent, how do the providers of the umbrella think about this possibility? I could imagine multiple sorts of approaches. One would be, we were extending this, and we know it might have some adverse consequences, but the bigger security picture is more important. Or are they thinking perhaps by doing this, we might be able to restrain this adversary from causing problems? How do the providers think about the nuclear umbrella?
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. That's a great question. I mean, I think it's probably a combination of both. It is this hope that the extension of the umbrella will mollify some of the concerns of the allies and create enough of this sense of assurance that allies are feeling satiated and not likely to go and press their claims even further. And then I think they have other considerations that they're really attuned to. So especially with Taiwan, with South Korea, even in some of the early conversations about potentially providing security assurances to India and Pakistan, the hope was that if we were to provide those security assurances, whether through concrete, tangible defensive agreements or through sort of informal security agreements, it would prevent their own desire to go and acquire nuclear weapons and further proliferation. So especially when it came to Taiwan, part of the agreement for these institutional defensive agreements was Taiwan would agree not to pursue nuclear weapons, but to stop their nuclear weapons programs in exchange for having US military support, including potentially the use of nuclear weapons if necessary. So the US is sort of facing this dilemma of how do I assure these clients without worrying about their behavior, especially when it comes to one-sided use of force. But simultaneously, I have my other analysts at the State Department telling me if we don't go and pursue this, they might go and acquire nuclear weapons. There's all sorts of other examples of this from throughout the historical record, but I think it's pretty clear that there were multiple strategic concerns sort of happening simultaneously that made some of these decisions pretty complicated.
Great, thank you. So we actually have a question that follows on neatly with what you were just discussing. Paul Normal asked, has there been an examination in the context of your research of the difference in behaviors of states who are largely content under the Patron's nuclear umbrella compared to those who might be looking to develop their own nuclear capabilities or for one reason or another aren't content?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And it's something that's been really hard for analysts to try to figure out, in part because we have a really hard time, we meaning the United States, has a really hard time assessing whether or not allies are actually content, in part because they have every reason to pretend like they're not content to try to get further assistance from us or further assurances from the US that there's going to be this strengthened commitment in the event of foreign aggression. I think we're sort of seeing that play out pretty markedly right now, where despite the massive increase in military and economic assistance from the United States to NATO member states and even to partners, I don't want to call Ukraine an ally because it is a neutral state, but even to partners or friendly states, there's always this sense of you need to be doing more. And that plays out in alliances all the time. In Taiwan, during the first and second Taiwan Straits crises, Chiang Kai-shek was adamant that there was still not a significant amount of commitment from the United States, that they were unassured about the strength of the US commitment. And one of the only ways that the US could possibly convince Taiwan that they were serious was placing nuclear weapons on Taiwan soil and engaging in offensive attacks against the mainland China and the PLA forces. Now, that's a huge commitment and something that would require a significant change in US posture. And that would have been one of the few things that would have made Taiwan outwardly content. So we're sort of seeing that play of national interests come out through alliances in a way that it's really hard for us empirically to determine. That's why we have to go to some degree to the qualitative historical record and look at statements from leaders and try to see whether or not there's ever been a period in which allies are satisfied. And we even see that today with the pivot to Asia and yet NATO member states actively asking for enhanced assurances and commitments from the United States because they're concerned about that commitment.
Right, and just a quick follow-up that triggered in my mind with your answer. Have you all looked at the impact that actually possessing or having American nuclear weapons on the soil of the client, the effect that has on the behavior of the client state, right? Because you mentioned, Chiang Kai-shek wanted them in Taiwan, thinking about where American weapons are in Europe and in Asia, for example, during the Cold War. Based on where they were, when they were, was there a difference in the aggressive behavior of client states?
So that's a fantastic question, and it's something that we have not looked at, but definitely some other scholars have. There has been work on physical tripwires, including the placement of U.S. personnel on Allied soil. I think that was one piece that was done by Todd Sexer. Also, Eric Gardsky and Koji Kagatano did another piece on that. I think it's something that's really interesting. And what that suggests, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about this in your class tomorrow, Ryan, is that some of the forms of assurance that we are willing to provide, especially to partners or allies where they're operating in a very tense, very dangerous environment, and that physical troops would be considered a tripwire and a real risk of escalation, is the use of emerging technologies. And even today, right before I logged on to this talk, we saw that President Biden is willing to send drones to Ukraine as part of a military assistance package, but and some other pieces of equipment as well. But that was one way to sort of provide assurance without providing escalatory concerns, where Russia might then attack U.S. personnel or attack U.S. assets that would make it incumbent for the United States to join the conflict. So there are some ways in which, yes, we're seeing the interest in physical tripwires of troops. That would be one way in which you could really mollify the concerns of NATO member states, especially right now. But the United States and other countries have historically been reticent to do that, and instead tried to look to other forms of technology or other forms of capabilities to help provide that assurance without providing those escalatory risks.
Great. Thank you. So again, as folks have questions, please drop them in the Q&A queue, and I will pose them to Dr. Mehta. We have a question from Michael Kenny, the director of the Ridgeway Center. And he says, thank you for your fascinating talk. And you mentioned Ukraine, so we will go there. How credible do you think Putin's nuclear saber rattling over Ukraine actually is? And relatedly, what can the US do to support Ukraine militarily against the invasion of their country that does not risk a nuclear response from Russia?
Thank you for your question, Professor Kenny. I wish I had an answer to the first part, at least. I think if I did, I'd maybe have a different job right now. I have done a deep dive into Putin, as I suspect a lot of IR scholars have done over the past couple of weeks. And I'm sure I'm barely scratching the surface of what is a very complicated adversarial profile that many others have spent decades working on. So I'll do my best to answer the question primarily based on what I've read from other analysts and other experts on Putin, including Rose Gadamuller, as well as journalists like Masha Gessen and Julia Ioffe, who have spent their whole lives researching this question. I guess what I would ultimately come down to is likely not. He's likely not going to use nuclear weapons, and saber rattling is all part of this entire conflict. He has done that since the beginning, when he started amassing hundreds of thousands of troops on Ukrainian border. I think if there had been an agreement that was signed to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine, that saber rattling might have just been saber rattling. I think that is also true now. If the United States concedes and we refuse to offer economic and military assistance and/or lift economic sanctions, it would just be saber rattling. The concern with this nuclear saber rattling is that we just don't know. He's a very complicated individual. It's not clear that he's getting advice from his counselors that is sound. It looks like he's getting a lot of advice from a core group of people that are like-minded, and so there's not a lot of pushback. But from what we have heard, especially from the Biden administration, including members of the National Security Councils, the established nuclear hotline between the United States and Russia has helped to sort of limit any ambiguity or confusion, especially when it comes to specific actions like putting Russian nuclear forces on alert. We have not seen parallel actions by the United States to do the same. All of this is to say that it's really unclear. I think in general, when you have a personalist dictator regime like the one we're seeing in Russia, they're not interested in regime suicide. They're not interested in the full annihilation of their country. That might be one of the few things that saves us, is some of the research that's been done by Barbara Geddes, by Jessica Weeks and others really suggests that there is this inherent desire for survival, especially among autocratic leaders like Putin. And that might be something that is ultimately helpful. But I think in the short term, we can expect to see more nuclear saber rattling. I think we can expect to see more minor instances of provocations or even statements about interest in contemplation about using chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine. But ultimately, I think that we're not likely to see him actually use nuclear weapons. It's just a ploy to get the United States to concede, and I think he's unfortunately miscalculated our resolve here.
Thank you. So we just had an anonymous attendee pose a question that's similar. It's along these same lines, and it highlights some of the more fatalistic takes that we've seen from Fiona Hill and others about how we really are in World War III, and that the use of nuclear weapons is likely. I mean, you just noted that I personally, my read of the situation is similar to yours. I would be surprised if nuclear weapons were used. But what do you see as sort of the clearest path to potential use, right? Under what conditions would you expect to see the taboo broken, and either non-strategic weapons used on the battlefield or potentially something worse?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the scenario that's been playing out in a lot of people's head. And I mean, Fiona Hill's an expert on this, and I'll ultimately defer to her. I read the same analysis and was scared to death, basically. I think there's a couple instances in which we might see Putin decide, because he feels like he's backed into a corner, decide to use nuclear weapons. I think there's two that I see as sort of the most likely, but still relatively unlikely. The first is if we get into week 6 or 7 of this conflict and there's still no concrete gains made in terms of taking Kyiv or others important tactical cities like Odessa in the south, he might just be so frustrated by the lack of progress or even increasing reports of mutiny or abandonment by Russian soldiers of key technologies, or sort of continued reports of troop fatalities. He might be so frustrated by the lack of progress that he decides that the best way to shift the balance of power back in his favor is the use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Western Ukraine, somewhat close to the Polish border, in a way that really necessitates NATO involvement that would escalate this to something akin to World War III. The second scenario in which I think that that's possible is if there were to be any fracture within the NATO alliance, any use of emboldenment or moral hazard by one of the NATO member states to go and try to press their claim, either by moving NATO member forces into Ukraine, into Western Ukraine specifically, or so any sort of troop movement that would then suggest NATO is now actively a combatant in this into this conflict. And I guess the very last way, and I just wrote about this a little bit with a colleague of mine who's a cyber expert, is if there were to be a massive cyber attack on Russian infrastructure, critical infrastructure, or other assets that they feel is sort of existential to the Russian state survival beyond the economy, which we've already seen has been pretty decimated. I think the Russians could see that as the incorporation or the inclusion of the United States as a combatant in this conflict, and then they would say that this is now triggering their 2-phase nuclear posture, which was just adjusted last year. I think it was something that was any attack, conventional or otherwise, on Russian that impacts the existence of the Russian state could then trigger a nuclear response. So those are the three that I think are the most likely. I still think that they're relatively unlikely. But the fact that there are three tangible scenarios for which we could see the use of nuclear weapons is all the more concerning. I think all the more suggestive of the need for de-escalatory off-ramps from this conflict. And we're starting to see some hints at that today between Ukraine and Russia, but it's unclear whether or not that's actually going to lead to a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement to this conflict.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask you a little bit more about that second pathway that you mentioned, an emboldened NATO ally. And maybe you can fold in and discuss a little bit of the other part of your research in the book. I mean, obviously that's something that the Biden administration would want to avoid. What does your work on the project of restraining client states suggest? You know, if you were able to provide advice to the many national security professionals working on this issue right now, I mean, what are some key things that the U.S. would want to keep in mind to prevent that potential pathway from becoming more real?
Yeah, it's tough. And especially I think during crisis time or during wartime, it's even harder because some of what our research suggests in terms of redesigning or creating those constraints on allies happens during peacetime, when you can actually offer incentives, or you can create ambiguity and uncertainty about whether or not you're actually going to be there to defend the ally in a way that makes them less assured, in a way that allows you to adjust the institution. It's really hard to do any of that during periods of crisis, in part because one of the key things, if not the key thing, that is working to the benefit of the United States and Europe right now is the strength of the NATO deterrent and the strength of Article 5. So my research would say, or our research would say, now is not really the time to be making those types or creating those forms of uncertainty for our allies, but rather I think it's the time for us to be focusing on providing incentives to ensure that there aren't NATO member states that are engaging in really risky, emboldened behavior akin to moral hazard that could then necessitate the use of force by NATO member states against Russia, or I think one of the clearest example is creating a no-fly zone. This has been discussed pretty heavily throughout the both policymakers and policy analysts, as well as pleas from President Zelensky and others about the creation of a no-fly zone, and maybe even using specific pilots from specific member states of NATO to do that. That would be a pretty clear example of moral hazard, the type of moral hazard that we absolutely need to try to avoid, in part because if we have NATO member states shooting down Russian jets to enforce that no-fly zone, that would be the type of escalatory behavior that would, from Russia's perspective, make the use of nuclear weapons more appealing to them, even though there is this general taboo or this general sense of nuclear weapons being antithetical to the survival of the regime.
Thank you. So our question queue is empty at the moment. If others have questions, please do put them in. But I'd be interested in hearing you talk a little bit more about Taiwan, given the research that you all have done on Taiwan. I mean, there's a lot of discussion now about how is China going to interpret the West's behavior towards Russia with events going on in Ukraine? And you have some folks saying, well, China is going to be emboldened because clearly Putin he has a freer hand than he otherwise might because of his nuclear arsenal. It's very likely that any negotiated solution is going to give him something that he wants, Crimea, the Donbass, maybe a land bridge between the two. And so thinking forward, especially given the statements Xi Jinping has made about wanting to resolve the Taiwan issue in this period, whatever that means, that China might be emboldened. You have others saying, China's looking at the very rapid economic isolation of Russia, and that would be much harder for the world to do to China, given how much more integrated it is than Russia was. But there's been a lot less discussion about how we might think about Taiwan, right? The research that you presented today suggests that, depending on the outcome of Taiwan's next election, you might get a more belligerent leadership in Taipei, right? What lessons are you concerned that Taipei might take away from the situation in Ukraine? And because we aren't currently engaged in hostilities in the Western Pacific, what are the steps forward there to try and damp down those prospects?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. In fact, even just today or yesterday, the U.S. ambassador to China had an op-ed, I think, in the New York Times or Washington Post about exactly this question, which is, for many of us who have been trying to think about what the implications are for U.S., Taiwan, China in the future, it's been challenging because I think there's a lot of lessons that both the US, Chinese, and the Taiwanese are learning from this experience. I think one example or one implication that is being made more clear, and I'm not exactly sure this is true, and I think it's more dangerous than it is providing a security or assurances. You could argue, and some have, that if Ukraine had kept their nuclear weapons infrastructure and arsenal that they had inherited at the end of the Cold War, at the fall of the Soviet Union, that they would not be in this position, right? And so one potential implication that we're seeing, and we're already seeing some murmurings among South Koreans, for example, is if we acquire nuclear weapons, we'll be protected in a way that the Ukrainians were not, and this could be the start of nascent interest in proliferation amongst a bunch of countries or allies that are in really dangerous situations with adversaries like Taiwan is with China. So that's one implication. Again, I hope that that's not the case. There's all sorts of concerns that come from proliferation, especially in Taiwan, but that is one implication, especially if you're Taipei. I think the other is there's, the situation with Ukraine is different in part because they're not included in this multilateral alliance. They're a friend and partner, so to speak, but they're not part of NATO, so they don't have that institutional agreement. Taiwan's probably very happy that they have something akin to that, so that they have this sort of formal defensive agreement that requires our security and protection. But I do think that in terms of whether or not you're likely to see a more belligerent take from Taipei, especially moving forward, it probably is the case, in part because what this has demonstrated over the past 3 weeks is some of our norms and some of the sort of unwritten rules of the road since the end of the Cold War in terms of territorial sovereignty and integrity have been violated. And it is really hard to come back from that. So the fact that Russia has been very successful 3-4 times now in terms of taking over territory that is not theirs, either fully or in pieces, with Georgia, Chechnya, and now Ukraine and the Donbass region, and now the rest of Ukraine, there are some concerns, especially for Taiwan, but other places, that those standards, those norms of territorial sovereignty are being violated and are weakened as a result of this. I think China is learning other lessons. I think it's seeing the coalitional power of NATO, especially when it comes to the absolute substantive and strength of the sanctions package that we have put together over the past 3 weeks. I think they're slightly more insulated and feel slightly less vulnerable, in part because of their greater interdependence with the US economy and just the size of their economy. But I think that they are probably looking at the fact that NATO has been pretty cohesive and very robust in their sanctions, and are looking at that and are slightly worried. I think the United States is probably concerned about all of these alliances. I mean, they pose threats, not just in terms of whether or not they entrap the US into these costly, unwanted conflicts, but they're global disruptors. And so anytime you have a situation in which there's a partner or an ally or even an institutionalized member of an alliance on the border or next to an adversary that has been clear that they are not going to respect territorial boundaries, that gets very complicated, and it produces all sorts of strains on both the US domestic and international politics. I think we'll learn a lot about the Chinese stance moving forward, especially as it becomes more clear the conditions under which China is willing to maintain its relationship. I think it was called something like a friendship without bounds, or if it decides to side with the rest of the international community against the Russians, not because of any moral or ethical standards or concerns, but simply because it's not good business for them. So we'll get a sense of what the Chinese do in the next few weeks. But we're starting to see some fissures, and that's interesting and potentially important.
So Michael Kenny has a follow-up to what you were just saying. He says, following your logic regarding what China might be learning, doesn't this suggest that the US should work to increase the cost to Putin for the invasion of Ukraine?
I think so. I mean, that's a great question, Professor Kenny, and I certainly think it is the case that it seems like the United States is doing as much as it can to increase the cost economically to Putin. I still think that there is a balance to be made between engaging in behavior that the Russians could take as a threat to their survival in a way that escalates this into a global conventional or nuclear conflict that nobody is interested in. And because there is uncertainty about what Putin is thinking and whether or not the survival of the regime is more important to him than his ego, I think there is this unknown risk that Fiona Hill and others are talking about. I just think we're in a place of a lot of uncertainty. What does raising the risks to Putin look like other than creating a no-fly zone, placing NATO troops on Ukraine's borders, involving the United States in the conflict, or NATO in the conflict as a real combatant? I don't know what that looks like. I think we're doing as much as we can on the economic front. I think we're doing a substantial amount on the military assistance front, but what does that look like without really raising the risks of conflict? I really don't know. I wish I did. I wish I could sort of see into the future about that, and I would, again, have a different job. But I would love to hear your perspective on this. I think this is something that I'm lacking, because I'm definitely not an expert in Russian politics or even on this issue, but I'm so curious to hear what people sort of see as the next possible steps for the US as we enter into week 4 of this seemingly unending conflict.
So he followed up and said he was thinking more along the lines of increasing military costs by sending drones and other conventional weapons. But your point stands that it's hard to sort of suss out what exactly, how exactly those costs could be imposed without potentially pushing in directions that we don't want to go. That Robert Caddy actually asks about. And his question is, what would NATO's likely response be to Russian use of a tactical nuclear weapon on a Ukrainian military target that isn't near a NATO border? And then I would just tag on to say, so maybe you can answer Robert's question, and then sort of pivot to your own work, because given that there is a real possibility of non-strategic use of nuclear weapons, do you think that the use of nuclear weapons for the first time since 1945 might have any impact on the pattern of behaviors that you all have detected in your research, right? Might otherwise, ambitious clients think twice if there's a more recent example of use of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, those are fantastic questions. So to answer the first one about what's the potential likelihood of a non-strategic use of nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil, not near a NATO member state, I mean, it's so hard to know the answer to that, in part because no one has been interested in drawing a red line for behavior. I think driven by the fact that their red lines are so notoriously difficult to maintain, because no one wants to put a stake in the ground as to what their reaction is going to be if something horrific like that is done. We haven't heard conversations even from the Biden administration about what a potential response would look like. I think I've seen murmurings of, they'll face consequences unlike nothing ever seen before, which is possibly true. But I don't know what that looks like. So I guess what I would say is, if it were to be the case that there was a use of nuclear weapons, non-strategic tactical nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory by the Russians, I mean, first of all, the humanitarian effects of that would be absolutely catastrophic. I think we're already starting to see real concern of that by Europeans. I read an article and heard from some friends who are in Sweden and Norway that there's been a run on potassium iodide pills because of concerns of either unintended attacks on Chernobyl or other nuclear power plants, or the use of nuclear weapons. So there's definitely some concern of that. I think it would necessitate the inclusion of the US and NATO as full-fledged combatants in the conflict. But I don't know whether or not it would lead to the risk of nuclear war between the United States and Russia. Likely not. I think they would look for de-escalatory off-ramps at that point as well. Russia has a posture of escalate to de-escalate. So they believe in escalating to the use of force in such egregious ways. I think we're seeing that with the attacks on civilian infrastructure and civilian targets, as a means to get people to come to the negotiation table simply to stop the carnage. So that is not something outside the realm of possibility. But because we haven't heard what the potential reactions would be from the United States or from NATO, other than consequences unlike we've ever seen before, it's really unclear what the expectations should be for that. I think, and Brian, can you remind me what the second question was?
Yeah, so it was my question, sort of looking forward and thinking about the world after a potential use, right? Like thinking about your theoretical model.
Yeah.
Implicit is sort of this assumption on the part of the client that the inherent threat posed by the provider of the nuclear umbrella is going to do the work.
Right.
And it's easy to sort of conceptualize that as an abstract thing when the last time nuclear weapons have been fired in anger was in 1945.
Right.
If we do enter a world where Putin uses a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, do you think that calculation among clients might be different given the more recent, more visceral experience of what actual use of nuclear weapons to fulfill threats would look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a world where that happens, great question, by the way, I think all bets are off in terms of what we can expect from allies' behavior. I think that allies are going to stop buying into this institutional capability aggregation argument, and instead say, well, the only way to protect myself and my territorial sovereignty is if I have nuclear weapons on my border. I think there's likely to be a free-for-all in terms of proliferation. I think there could be this sense of utter, I mean, I would hope as a human that there's a sense of utter horror about the use of nuclear weapons that would make everyone want to not have them and to never use them again. But I'm too cynical, I think, to believe that that would be the response. I think what's more likely to happen, I hope not, but I think what's more likely to happen is people believe that the only way to protect themselves is to acquire their own nuclear weapons, or to acquire other weapons of mass destruction that make that potentiality unlikely in the future. I think client states could say to the United States, or to other nuclear armed patrons, I'm either going to need physical nuclear weapons on my territory, I'm going to need US personnel on my territory as a tripwire, so that if someone attacks me, they're attacking you, and you are absolutely required to defend me in a way that other forms of military assistance is not immediately, does not produce the same effects. I mean, I think the world that we would be living in if Russia were to engage in such reckless, such horrific behavior would be so markedly different. I'm not even sure that the normal standards of our alliance institutions would even be the same. But I think, and I would be so curious to hear what my colleagues like William Spano, who's in the audience, I'll ask him later about this, but what does he think about it? I can't imagine that the result is just this sense of, well, we must never have them again. I would love to think that, but I think I'm a little too cynical for that.
Thank you. So we're running low on time, and you've admirably answered the questions posed by our audience, and so I think we should go ahead and wrap up. And so I want to say thank you again, Rupal, for a really interesting talk at a time when, as I said at the beginning, more people are thinking about nuclear weapons than have thought about nuclear weapons in decades. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning of today's program, this talk was the first of 3 that the Ridgway Center is going to be hosting. On March 30th, Dr. Avery Goldstein from the University of Pennsylvania is going to be here, and he's going to be talking about China's nuclear arsenal, its modernization, and implications for thinking about nuclear matters moving forward. And then on April 12th, Dr. Rachel Whitlark, a frequent co-author of Dr. Mehta, will be here to talk about counterproliferation, specifically the use of force in preventing other states from getting nuclear weapons. So if you're available, please do join us. We'd love to have you and your questions. And just as a final word, I'd like to put out a special thanks to the 2 people who've been working behind the scenes to really make everything go as smoothly as possible. Ms. Sandy Monteverde and Ms. Jordan Kamasa have done yeoman's work in making today's presentation viable, in making it work. And so thank you to them. Thank you once again, Rupal. It's been a delight. And I look forward to talking to you tomorrow in my class with my students and seeing you in the future when we're not necessarily in this virtual setting. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.